Hi, everyone. Let's talk a little bit about international trade, and specifically some of the theories that surround it. International trade is one of the more significant aspects that we'll talk about in this class. Obviously, it has an impact and is impacted by almost everything else that we've discussed thus far. One of the central things to understand about international trade is that it's big. It's a very complex system that totals to approximately $20 trillion a year around the globe. And it is truly a great example of a collective goods problem. So what we see in this is that international trade exists for the potential mutual benefit of every single country. No country on earth has everything that it needs to sustain itself as far as imports and exports go. So by necessity, countries will have to trade with other countries to be able to sustain their population, whether that come to food, whether that come to natural resources, whether that come to economic stability. All of these things are necessary for countries to function and are part and parcel of this global international trade that we have. That means that we can take some similar approaches to what we have for our other areas of international relations as far as how we study these things. There are going to be these core themes that we'll see represented in international trade as well. Things like reciprocity, things like global governance, things like power politics that really all come into play when we're talking about international trade. Now, the first theory of international trade that we'll talk about is mercantilism. This is really the realist approach to international trade. So if you remember back to our theories from the beginning of the semester, this one seems most based in realism. It essentially says that trade should be undertaken for the self-interest of countries. They are the largest players on this international scale of trade, and therefore each of them is competing for their own self-interest and is pursuing those goals in their international trade relations. That means that the most important things that they are pursuing are going to be their own national security, and they're ensuring that their country is going to be the one that comes out on top as best they can. This takes a very zero-sum approach to international trade. In other words, when one country benefits, it is most likely at the disadvantage of another country. Now, it means that mercantilism really downplays the role of international organizations in international trade. States are the foremost actors on the world stage when it comes to international trade, so they're the only ones that can really influence this kind of policy. That also means that we're looking at a higher importance placed in mercantilism on just exports and imports as essentially the transactional values that are inherent in this international trade system. Exports being the things that a country produces above its own necessity that it can send to other countries, and imports being the things that it must bring in because it has a lack of those within its own production lines. That means that we're focused on creating as much as possible really a positive trade relationship or a trade surplus. The negative side of that then, since this is a zero-sum game, is going to be a trade deficit, where you're unable to produce or unable to bring in as much as you need to be able to maintain your country. So how do you best pursue that self-interest or protecting your own trade surplus as best you can? Well, it's in the word. We use a term called protectionism to describe this approach that countries may take to ensuring their own surplus. Protectionism really speaks to utilizing your own national resources, so your ability to influence international trade and your own domestic policy to really ensure the success of your own country in this international system, whether that be by manipulating the type of trade deals that you have, utilizing something like military force or a position that you may have as being the most powerful trading partner in an organization or in an international system, and also protecting your own domestic production capabilities. So essentially protecting or defending the preference for your national national industries. This can be things that are vital to a nation's national security, things like agriculture or defense, things like your energy production. All of these are areas that a country may have a vested interest in protecting over necessarily importing or having a strong foreign influence in these types of markets. Now, there are a few different ways that countries can do this. They can pursue this through tariffs, so essentially, exercising specific taxes on imports or exports of goods, instituting quotas, which is when a country states that they'll only take so much of a certain product from another specific country, creating subsidies or loans that help to subsidize the independent internal production lines of a product, or even resorting to something as far as economic nationalism, which is the complete preference for local goods, national goods within a country over importing things from outside of a country. This is something that we see very frequently. We see this appeal to buy local or buy only goods from the United States. That kind of approach is a protectionist ideal on how to approach this overall big idea of international trade. Now, as in all things theory-based, there is a counterpoint to this, and instead of creating a new word for economic realism like they did with mercantilism, we really just call this economic liberalism. So this idea rejects most of those basic assumptions that we see under mercantilism. This is not a zero-sum game. There is the potential for all countries participating in this international trade process to gain benefits, to mutually benefit from this system. And that's not necessarily a bad thing if that is what happens. The best way that we can pursue this is to establish a truly free trade system that interacts globally. We live under a system of anarchy. We can create some of these multinational or global kind of institutions to help trade, but we need a free trade system that is somewhat volatile and does follow the basic principles of trade agreements, even on the domestic level. So this reestablishes the necessity for international organizations. They can help to ensure this free trade process and create these longer-term mutual benefits that can exist for countries. They can also help to provide the security that through a boom and bust system that exists in almost any economic system, that these benefits will still be there for the long term. They can guarantee a country's position within this trade organization for a much longer period of time than if the country was just set out after its own self-interests. So a real basic understanding, I think, of supply and demand is necessary here. Don't worry if you've never taken a business class, this will be the absolute simplest version. When you take a typical supply and demand curve, you understand that there is a point known as equilibrium. Now, a perfect equilibrium does not exist. A perfect equilibrium would be the exact amount produced matches the exact amount needed in any system. But we want to gain or come as close as possible to equilibrium within economic systems. And this is true of international trade as well. Ideally, the things that a country produces and the things that a country puts out into the international system would be somewhat reciprocated by the things that it brings in through imports. And therefore, in an ideal world, the countries will be putting out things that other countries need and taking in the things that they need from the other countries that are producing those. This overall idea does kind of necessitate a rejection of this protectionist ideology. It's not up to the individual countries to protect their needs. It's put more on these international institutions and on this system of give and take that a country will be provided for in the end. Now, there are a couple of advantages to this free trade idea. The first is that countries can essentially specialize in what kind of products they produce. Instead of having to have a broad base of production that you can imagine would be necessity if you're out for your own self-interest or if you're out for a protectionist aspect, instead you can specialize. Saudi Arabia can produce oil. They can focus on just producing oil because they know know if they produce enough of that, it is of enough need to other countries in the world that they'll be able to trade for anything that they may then need, any other deficits in their own trade economy. So this is kind of a benefit. Countries will specialize in things, especially products that will give what we call a comparative advantage. So things that are high demand products around the world. We also see that the key then to maximizing this effort is to produce as many of those goods as possible so that you're putting yourself into a somewhat economically beneficial or somewhat superior position to other countries around the world. That helps you to dictate some of the needs that you have and to, expect fairer prices from other countries. Essentially, it's a liberal way of instituting this kind of mercantilist, specialization and interest that countries may want to have. Now, the downsides of free trade are also fairly well known. Unfortunately, free trade is a system that I think arises out of this sort of post-colonialism that we discussed with the environment. We have changed the form of how that colonialism works. So now instead of direct invasion or, a country directly oppressing another nation, instead we now have a sort of economic system that does the same thing. If free trade truly exists, then the bottom line, the profit line, is going to be the primary goal of any organization that's engaging with this international trade. And that means that if they can find cheaper labor somewhere outside of their country, they're going to tend to pursue that. That means that just by participating in this system of a truly free international trade, local wages for any sufficiently developed country are going to be suppressed because you can find cheaper labor somewhere else in the world. And as we develop our technological capabilities of being able to produce something in one part of the world and ship it easily and quickly to another part of the world, you see this more and more. We see that there are approximately 20 million children, people under the age of 13, that are employed, that are participating in this system as production around the world. And those are primarily concentrated in the global south. So again, we see this as sort of another juxtaposition of how the power dynamic becomes unequal between the developed and the developing world or countries of the world. This also leads to, some of the other issues we've already discussed. So workplace conditions are a concern. Obviously, environmental issues are also a concern when we get to this point of the bottom line, the profit margin being the only goal. The environment is not necessarily good for the economy if you're taking it at this very base level. So why bother protecting the environment? Why bother having, environmentally conscious practices if that's something that's going to hurt your overall bottom line? So that was just an introduction to some of these main theories that surround the idea of international trade. Hopefully that clears some of them up for you, and we'll see you again next week. Thanks. Have a great day.